أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد فقد قال الله عز وجل بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لقد جاءكم رسول من أنفسكم عزيز عليه ما عنتم حريص عليكم بالمؤمنين رؤوف رحيم صلوا على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I would like to request all of us to recite a Surah Fatiha for Sayyid Zainul Abidin, whose family has sponsored tonight's majlis, for Marhum Sayyid Zainul Abidin and for all other Marhumin. Let us recite a Surah Fatiha preceded by Salawat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. For the last few nights we have been discussing certain aspects of the life and the legacy of our Prophet of Islam, teachings of the Quran, verses of the Quran, and principles by which the Prophet lived that are essential to our understanding of our obligations as Muslims. But sometimes these aspects of the legacy of the Prophet are forgotten within our practice and within our communities. We spoke, for example, about the fact that the Prophet emphasized, and the Quran also applied the principle that there should be a level of objectivity in how we view and describe and understand our circumstances. We shouldn't look at things on the basis of our prejudice. Because we are Muslims, everything we do is good or is right or has some kind of justification, but everything that everyone else does is wrong and evil and deficient. And that should apply to all of our relationships. And we gave examples from the life of the Prophet, how even the teachings of Islam and even those rules which were to be obligations for the Muslims. And you might think that Allah would want to give an obligation by making you think that there is everything good about what He is telling us to do, and there is only evil in what He is telling us to abstain from. But when it comes to prohibiting alcohol, when it comes to prohibiting gambling, when it comes to other obligations and prohibitions, Allah doesn't want to give us that kind of a false narrative so that we don't really understand what it is that we are being asked to do and what it is that we are being asked to avoid. But we should have an insight, we should have an objective understanding, and based on that, we should be able to have the motivation to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If a person avoids gambling because they think that there is only evil in gambling and there can never be any form of good, then they will avoid the sin, but they will not be able to appreciate the verse of Quran and the wisdom of the commandment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because they will be presented with certain things where there is a small amount of good and a great deal of evil, and in those instances they might not be able to have the motivation to avoid sin. The same thing applies with many other things within life and also with our relationships with our fellow human beings. There are people who, in a marriage, they have a partiality to their own family, and they view their spouse or their spouse's family as if it is, I would say, an opposing team in sports, but sometimes it goes beyond that. It's as if there are two people coming to a negotiation from opposite parties. Everything that I do or somebody who is on my good book does, that is going to be assumed to have a good motivation and some kind of justification, even when it's wrong. But everything that the other party does, the opposing team or the opposing enemy forces do, that is going to be assumed to have some kind of ulterior motive, some kind of subterfuge, some kind of sabotage must be involved. And this is something which it is human nature to embark on, but Allah wants us to be able to move beyond that in all dimensions of our lives. So we mentioned some examples of that, and we moved on from that to a discussion of our relationship with other religions. Islam was meant to be a religion that gives a favorable push and uplifting to the religious practice and the devotion and the importance of putting monotheism front and center for all religions throughout the world. Islam should be a force, and Muslims should be a force that will encourage others to also be more pious and to think about piety. Because the view of Islam is, and the supreme confidence that was demonstrated in the life of the Prophet is, that when people understand that moral questions are important, when people understand that piety and the desire to be a good person, and then to think and ponder about what it means to be a good person, when these things become important in the life of a human individual or in the life of a society, then naturally people's hearts will begin to incline towards the truth, and their hearts will begin to incline towards Islam. And that's something which is not just an empty claim, it is something which has been demonstrated time and time again throughout history and in our own time. But for many of us, we sometimes are not willing to let that process take place. We want to take a shortcut. Just to give one example, it is sometimes controversial among the followers of Ahlul Bayt and those who pride themselves in calling themselves the Shia of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. Please recite salawat. It is sometimes controversial about how we are to refer to the individuals and the incidents that took place in the early days of Islam. Sometimes we have a level of awareness and insight about certain events and certain individuals who were involved in those events that makes us unable to view the early history of Islam and the early personalities of Islam with colored lenses. We cannot buy that idealization and that picture which is painted, that everybody was good, everybody was pious, everybody was sincere. When they had disputes, then it was something that must have happened by coincidence, and when they came to blows, and when they came to battles, even that was something which does not really have any background, any reasons. There was no misunderstanding of the Sharia. There was no one in early Islamic history who might have perhaps misunderstood or deliberately misapplied the commandments and the teachings of the Prophet. We can't buy that romanticization of history. And that is a very, very important insight. Unfortunately, it is an insight which is lost to hundreds of millions of Muslims throughout the world. But the question is, what is the best way to show people and to convince people and to inform people that maybe their impression of Islamic history and then the lessons that are to be derived from that history are incorrect? I gave some examples from the Quran. The Quran corrects, and it says that it corrects many of the mistakes that were made by the Jewish and the Christian tradition with regard to the prophets of Bani Israel. But if you look at the way the Quran corrects those incidents, it doesn't do so by clarifying every aspect of the picture and trying to settle all controversies. It chooses its battles in order to be able to give a message which will make people who until now may have believed certain false stories about prophets like Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, or Prophet Dawood alayhi salam, or Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, or other prophets, and bring them to realize what it means to be a prophet sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And a similar kind of wisdom is needed for us as a Muslim community. We might have a certain recognition about what caused or what influenced those who did not live up to the promise that they had made to the Prophet and the commitment that they had made to their religion during the lifetime of the Prophet and after the lifetime of the Prophet. But if we focus on a superficial condemnation of those personalities, then the effect of that might be that we will actually make it more difficult for other people to learn and to benefit from the insight about what caused those incidents to take place and what caused certain people to be misguided. And so a wise course of action would be for us not to focus on the individuals, but for us to focus on what was done. That doesn't mean that we are making our peace with those who did not fulfill their commitment to the Prophet. It means that we are trying to convey the message with a wisdom that allows other people who might not understand it to also appreciate it. And there is a big difference between the two. When Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam heard his companions speaking ill of Muawiyah and his followers and his supporters, the Imam prevented them from doing that. Now, that's interesting, because for many of us, Muawiyah and the followers of Muawiyah are the clearest example of people who were never close to the Prophet in his lifetime and never followed the practice of the Prophet after his lifetime. And, second of all, Imam Ali himself was very explicit in many of his sermons, some of which have been preserved and reported in history, in Nahj al-Balagha and in other sources, in condemning Muawiyah and actually calling him out for not having ever fully believed in the message of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. And more than that, Imam Ali actually did go so far, at least at certain times during his caliphate, to pray against Muawiyah in his qunut. Some of you may have heard that for several decades, the Umayyads, they used to do la'an and they used to badmouth Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam from the pulpits of all of their masjids throughout the length and the breadth of their kingdom. But history tells us that it was Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam who began calling out Muawiyah, and Muawiyah did so in response. So Imam Ali alayhi salam was explicit, and he did not mince his words, he did not compromise on his principles. In his sermons, he was very clear and very direct when addressing Muawiyah and when informing people about Muawiyah. And not throughout his caliphate, but before and during the Battle of Siffin and at certain times, even in his prayers, the Imam would do qunut. Muawiyah would be able to claim that if he was praying against Imam Ali and Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, then he was just doing so in response. Of course, there is no tit for tat. Imam Ali's prayer was in fact the same prayer that was made by the Prophet, and that is reported in sources of Islamic history from all schools of thought. It was not something that Imam Ali had introduced. He was applying the general principles of Islam, and he was actually continuing even the same words that were used by the Prophet when he was calling out Muawiyah. But at the same time, we see that Imam Ali did say to his followers that don't badmouth Muawiyah. So there is an obligation that Imam Ali has as the head of Islamic society, responsible for the political and social well-being and for the religious principles of society. And there is a different responsibility which is held by the followers of Amir al-Mu'mineen. He says that when you talk, focus on what they are doing that is wrong. Because the Imam has enough knowledge and discipline through the protection that comes from being ma'soom, never to go above and beyond what is required in any one circumstance. He knows when to be very explicit, and he knows when to be somewhat more careful and circumspect in his terms. He knows how to condemn Muawiyah in a way that will be able to guide people who are misguided, but not misguide people who may be confused. But the Imam, when he saw that sometimes among his followers there are people who might not be able to do that, he says, focus on the actions. Focus on the shortcomings and the sins of your opponents. When you do so, not only will you be able to affirm your principles, but you will also be able to convey that message more effectively and bring other people to the truth. So don't view it as a partisan game. Don't view it as some kind of competition. View it as an effort to establish principles. And sometimes, if that means that you even have to not speak of people like Muawiyah and those who were supporters of Muawiyah as explicitly as they are worthy of being spoken of, then you should do that. Because if you can convince people by using a more delicate and a more indirect speech of why Muawiyah was wrong and absolutely unworthy of being given any kind of respect in terms of being a companion or a follower of the Prophet, then that is worth much more the ability to just say a word and express your own distaste for his actions and for the deviation that he caused within the Muslim Ummah. So this was one reminder for us that when we are discussing the legacy of the Prophet, these priorities, they are essential for us to remember, and they are essential for us to be able to follow. When we want to talk about the first three caliphs of Islam, we wish to speak in a way where our message and our words can be heard and can be understood by the great body of Muslims. And so we need to speak in a language which they can understand. And if by speaking in an objective and a detached way, we can bring them some insight about where the problems that we find within the Muslim Ummah now had their origin, then it is worth it to speak in a respectful way in order to achieve that end. Now, please recite salawat. And to make room for those who are coming in, I'm going to request you to please move forward. As you do move forward, please recite another salawat. Jazakumullah. I will leave that message there. Inshallah, we will return to it in some form when we talk about the akhlaq of the Prophet and the way that the Quran itself describes the akhlaq of the Prophet. And so I will leave this point and resume it when we discuss that, to the extent, in fact, as you will see, that the people came and objected to the extent to which the Prophet spoke nicely about people who didn't deserve to be spoken nicely about. The verses in Surah Tawbah, inshallah, we will discuss them in our future nights. But I want to leave that point, and then we continued our discussion by saying that part of that objectivity and part of that manner in which the Prophet wants us to deal with our societies is that he doesn't want us to judge people's Islam. Even if we have a suspicion that a person's Islam is less than sincere. There might sometimes be people who will join a masjid because they think that if you ask for people's kindness after salat, then you might be able to benefit from people's generosity. And that might be a motivation in some cases for people to associate with Muslims, even to visit a masjid. And that was the case even in the time of the Prophet. But as we mentioned, the Quran says, and the Prophet was very harsh with companions who would deal with people by saying that we're not going to assume that they are really Muslim. Now, the question that might have come up, and that will always come up in these circumstances, is that does that mean that we're going to have to go around wearing blinders over our eyes, assuming the best about everybody? Anybody who comes and says that I am a Muslim, I have to treat them as if they are a saint. I have to assume that they are sincere. And then if they come with a business proposal, I have to treat them as if they are worthy of it. If they come with a marriage proposal, I have to assume that they are sincere. If they come with any other kind of claim or any other kind of request, then I have to assume that they are good. That is absolutely not what Islam has said. Just one incident from the life of our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, illustrates the broader point. Ismail was the son of our sixth Imam. And he was the elder son of our sixth Imam. He is the son of the sixth Imam to whom the Ismaili school of thought associates itself. Although he never was a claimant to being an Imam. He passed away within the lifetime of Imam Ja'far Sadiq. Imam Ja'far Sadiq himself buried him, put him in his grave, and prayed for him, and so he never had a claim to being an Imam. But the Ismaili school of thought, they associate themselves with Ismail, the son of Imam Ja'far Sadiq, and their line of Imams afterwards, they claim descent from the line of Ismail, who was the son of our sixth Imam. Ismail once had a small sum of money that he had saved, and there was a person who was going on a business trip, I believe it might have been to Yemen, and he wanted to give that person some of the money so that he could engage in commerce, and they would divide the profits, which was known as mudaraba, a form of partnership. He came to his father, the Imam, and asked for his advice. Today, inshallah, we will begin talking a little bit about this concept of mashwara and advice that the Prophet emphasized and which the Quran also affirmed. The son of the Imam is coming to the Imam for advice about investing some of his money with this person. The Imam says, so-and-so is said to be a drunkard. They're known to drink alcohol. And so I don't think that you should entrust your money to that person. But the Imam didn't give a direct command. He didn't forbid. He was asked for his advice, and he gave that advice. But Ismail decided that he was still going to invest with that person. Now, the reason why he did so was, as he himself later on said, because it was hearsay. He never saw that person drinking, and so he assumed that it was his obligation to assume the best about a Muslim. Husnul dhan. You don't buy into every rumor, because people might come and tell you things deliberately wrong. They might come and tell you things that are based on misunderstanding. People who believe every rumor are people who destroy relationships at the drop of a hat. And sometimes they regret it, and sometimes they're too blinded even to know that they have destroyed something which might not be possible to be rebuilt. And so it was a noble intention, for which Ismail said that I am going to ignore the rumors and I'm going to trust the person. And so he entrusted the person. He went on that business trip, and he came back and said there wasn't any profit. And perhaps he may not have actually conducted the business with any kind of proper diligence and care. Perhaps he may not even have gone on the trip at all. But Ismail was left with not only no profit, but with his capital also having disappeared. Soon after, both Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam and Ismail, peace be salawat, both of them together went to Hajj, or it might have been Umrah. And when Ismail was doing tawaf of the Kaaba, he said in his prayer that, "O Allah, I ask you for compensation for what I have lost." And Imam Ja'far Sadiq heard these words. And he said that don't ask Allah for compensation and don't ask Allah for a reward. You lost the amount because you did not obey what Allah said to do. It was your mistake, and Allah does not say that He is going to compensate you for something that He told you not to do. I can't go to Las Vegas and gamble away my savings and then say, "Oh, Allah, you promised me risk, so grant me risk." I can't destroy my relationships with people by being a cynic, by being difficult to get along with, and then say to Allah, "Oh Allah, restore my relationships with my children, restore my relationships with my family." I can't go against what Allah has commanded and what is wise, and then when things break down, say that, "Allah, you are going to compensate for me. You are going to either fix it, or if it doesn't get fixed, then at least I will get a reward in the hereafter." There is no demand that we can make on Allah in this way. At this point, Ismail said to his father, "But I never saw him do anything wrong. So was I to believe the people?" And Imam Ja'far Sadiq said that no, when you have a element of trust, a decision that requires trust, then it's not a matter of listening to rumors, but it is a matter of doing your due diligence about what you are going to entrust your amanat to. Who are you going to consider worthy of an amanat that Allah has given you? And all of the possessions that we have, they are a trust that Allah has given us. Our time, whom we are going to associate with, we should do diligence about our friends and our associates. When we want to get married, we have to do diligence about the spouse. We have to make sure that the person is muttaqi. We have to make sure that the person is pious, that they are God-fearing, that they are sincere in their religion. The point is that we should not doubt a person's affirmation of Islam because we suspect. But whether the person be a new Muslim or a born Muslim, whether the person be somebody that we are related to, or whether it be somebody that we are unrelated to, when it comes to something that requires an element of trust, we have to test them. We have to make sure that we are doing our diligence and only then entrusting them. But that is a general principle. It should not be applied in a way that discriminates against a race or against a group unfairly. Now, this principle, it is related to a general principle which Islam has encouraged us to observe. And that is the principle of mashwara, of consultation. It's not just something that Islam has said that you and I need to engage in, because we have deficient intellect. And we might not know everything that is good for us or everything that is harmful for us. But it is actually something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded His Prophet also to engage in. In the Quran, we read in Surah Al-Imran in verse 159, where Allah addresses His Prophet, and these verses are said to have been revealed in the early part of the Prophet's life in Medina, approximately during the Battle of Uhud. Verse 159 of Surah Al-Imran, it says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَظًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْمُتَوَكِّلِينَ. That, O Messenger, it is through God's mercy that you are very gentle and very forgiving and compassionate with the Muslims. Had you been hard-hearted, had you been somebody who was harsh with them, they would have dispersed. They would have stayed with you. So, forgive them. If they have wronged the Prophet, فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ. Forgive them. And if they have done something which is a sin, وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ, then seek forgiveness from Allah as well. If it's a personal affront, they have wronged the Prophet is commanded by Allah to forgive them. If they have committed a sin against Allah, the Prophet is commanded to seek forgiveness from Allah for them. And then وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. And then ask for their consultation, consult them in your affairs. Now, this is something which might seem to be counterintuitive. We've spent several of our discussions saying that the Prophet was one to be followed, not somebody who needed anybody's advice, not somebody who needed anyone's guidance, not somebody who was in any way deficient, so that a person would be able to complete the information or the required principles so that the Prophet could make a decision. And that is true. But the Imams also were engaged in consultations with their followers. And something that was fortunate is that the Imams, they had followers who had, as a whole, a better understanding of what it means to be commanded by Allah to follow someone as a religious guide than many of the companions of the Prophet. And so the nature of the consultation of the Prophet, it can be understood if we look at the nature of the consultation of our Imams. Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, he once consulted with one of his companions, Fudayl ibn Yasar, about a certain matter. And the companion said, Ya Aba Abdullah, mithluka yastashiru mithli? Someone like you is going to be asking advice from somebody like me? And the Imam replied that, Fudayl, yes, you are to provide advice when I ask you for it. So if I say that I want to know your opinion or I want to know your advice, then you are to ask it. It is reported that Imam Muhammad Taqi al-Jawad alayhi salatu wassalam, he wrote to one of his companions, a very famous companion, Ali ibn Mahziyar, and asked him to give his opinion and his advice about a certain matter. Again, the Imam was not in need of that advice, but with the same philosophy. Imam Rida alayhi salatu wasalam once asked one of his companions for his opinion, and the companion expressed a similar kind of shock, that why would the Imam ask for his opinion? And the Imam explained the same principle, that the Prophet was commanded to ask advice. This is part of how we train our communities. In the West, we sometimes think that the ideal form of interaction among individuals is democracy. But in Islam, the ideal that we are to strive for is consensus. As followers of Ahlul Bayt, we know that that consensus also is not just a consensus among you and me, but it is a consensus which is a submission towards the guidance and the genuine and absolute and the complete truth as it has been revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But whether we have access to a ma'soom or whether we don't have access to a ma'soom, we have a direction in terms of what types of decisions we want to make. We don't simply think that a majority has any kind of credibility by virtue of being a majority. So we want to have some kind of a direction. We want to have some kind of a principle that we are reaching. We want to be able to have certainty. If we have a ma'soom, then it is to better understand the teachings and the commandments of that ma'soom. When we do not have a ma'soom, then in our families, with our wives and our children, or our husbands and our children, we're not running a democracy. But we should have a discussion with our families, with our dependents, in order to benefit from maybe their ideas and their experiences, and more importantly, to help train them and bring them up to speed with things that they might not have experienced or they might not know. So the mashwara of the Prophet and the mashwara of the Imams, it was meant as a form of training before all else for their followers and for their companions. Now, I explained to you a few examples of the instances in which our Imams would ask for advice from their companions. And by and large, when the Imams would do so, then their companions would be surprised because they knew that the Imam did not need their advice. And so they first wanted to find out in what capacity they were being asked to give their advice. Unfortunately, though, we see that in the time of the Prophet that was not always the case. In the Battle of Badr, the Prophet gathered his companions, the Muhajirin and the Ansar, and he asked for their advice about what to do with the trade caravan of Quraysh that was returning from Syria, and a small contingent of armed men that had been sent by Quraysh from Mecca in order to protect their caravan. Now, the reality of that situation was such that if they passed by Medina and the caravan felt that they did not have any fear from the Muslims in Medina, and that armed band which had come from the polytheists in Mecca felt that they did not have any threat from the Muslims in Medina, then slowly the polytheists would expand their radius of operations, and they would eventually begin to threaten the Muslims even within their own city. The Prophet wanted people to be proactive and the Muslims to realize that they shouldn't wait until they are attacked, but they should assert and defend their sovereignty and their rights. But he asked them for their opinion. Now, when the Prophet asked them for their opinion, many of the Muslims thought that the Prophet is really asking them, what do you think? Should we or should we not be proactive? Should we or should we not confront the polytheists? Should we or should we not assert our rights? The incident is narrated in books of hadith, it's narrated in books of tafsir, with two different levels of detail. In some cases, the advice that was given is mentioned. And generally, history likes to censor certain sensitive details when the words are mentioned. And so those reports that tell you what was said, they don't tell you who said them. Those reports that tell you who said things, they don't tell you what they said. But what we find in history is that when the Prophet asked for people's advice, قام أبو بكر فقال وأحسن. Abu Bakr stood up, he gave his advice, and he spoke well. And then he sat down. ثم قام عمر فقال وأحسن. And then Umar stood up, and he gave his advice, and he spoke well, أحسن, and then he sat down. ثم قام المقداد بن عمرو. And then Miqdad, who was one of the earliest Muslims, he stood up. He said, Ya Rasulullah, if you command us right now to run and to try to attack a caravan in the south of Mecca in the direction of Yemen, then we will do so. We had faith in you because we trust your judgment and your commands are coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not from yourself. So order us to do whatever your command is and we will do it. And now the report says that the Prophet praised Miqdad, and then he said, is there anybody else who will give his advice as well? Now, although we don't know what it means when the previous people who stood up and gave good advice, the contrast with Miqdad tells us that it was advice of a different nature. After the Prophet listened to Miqdad and praised him highly, people understood what the Prophet was trying to do. He wasn't asking for advice because he didn't know what Allah wanted. And he wasn't asking for advice because he did not understand what was right to do. He was asking for advice because he wanted to train and he wanted to ready the people in order to be able to fulfill a difficult task. The Prophet asked now a fourth time for people to give their opinion. And Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, one of the Ansaris, he stood up, he said, كَأَنَّكَ تُرِيدُنَا يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. It's as if you are asking about us. You want to know the opinion of the Ansar. And the Prophet said yes. Because the Ansar, until that time, they had pledged to support the Prophet, but they had not pledged to do battle. They had pledged to defend, but they had not pledged to fight proactively in order to prevent an attack. And the Prophet was not sure if they would give that commitment or not. And so Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, he understood the words of the Prophet. He said, O Messenger of God, if you order us to run our horses into the Red Sea, we will do so. We will protect you as we protect our own families, and we will obey you about matters of war and matters that will risk our lives and our livelihood, just as we will obey you about affairs of worship and ritual and religion. And now the Prophet was satisfied that his community had been prepared and ready, and then he began the preparations for the Battle of Badr, which was a major victory which allowed Islam to be able to be established and be practiced without fear and to spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula. Please recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ala So, consultation, mashwara, is a sacred obligation. And that is why there are numerous ahadith that condemn a person who does not think they need to ask for other people's advice, does not feel a need to consult with other people, but tries to solve his or her problems on his or her own terms. Now, we'll inshallah discuss more aspects of this important teaching of Islam and other aspects of the Prophet's etiquette and conduct in our future sessions. But we find that the preparation for service and for submission was one of the key demands that Allah made upon the believers. And when the Muslims were not willing to be submissive to the commandments of Allah, that is when they often suffered the greatest defeats. The Battle of Uhud, for which the Prophet was asked to seek forgiveness from his followers, that is one example of a time when that disobedience it led to a very clear defeat for the Muslims. But there were times after that as well. Our second Imam, Imam Hassan al-Mujtaba alayhi salatu wassalam, when he took the allegiance of the people after the martyrdom of his father, Amir al-Mu'mineen, one of the things which he said, and he emphasized, is that you will make peace with whomever I make peace, and you will do battle with whoever I do battle with. And many people, they began to get suspicious. They said the Imam is not just talking about battle. The Kufans now, they had regretted their mistake in Siffin, and many of them were very emotionally ready for battle. But Imam Hassan deliberately made that pledge because he didn't want to take advantage of their energy for battle and then find that just as they did in Siffin, their energy dissipates and there is a confusion within their ranks and they're not willing to obey their Imam. So he said, and he deliberately said, will you make peace with whomever I make peace? And will you do battle with whomever I do battle? And so that became a controversy. People said that the Imam is destroying our readiness and our energy in order to attack Muawiyah because they were not willing to submit to the Imam's command. They wanted simply to do battle. And that very enthusiasm for battle is what caused them to create that division and the breaking of the ranks within the followers of the Imam. And when the Imam saw that people were not united and did not have insight in following his command, then he began to work in a way that would preserve the life and the limb and the property of the broader Muslim community, and especially allow the followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam to be able to live in peace and spread the teachings of their faith. Imam Hassan alayhi salatu wassalam was never regretful, and he was never hesitant to do battle. But what he asked of his followers was to be able to appreciate the nature of their relationship to their Imam. The Imam does not need their guidance. The Imam does not need their advice. The Imam does not need them to tell him how to lead more effectively. He needs them to be able to come and be proper, enlightened, insightful, and submissive followers so that they will be able to achieve guidance by following the Imam. But because Imam Hassan did not have such followers, we find that he had a certain respect for the followers of Imam Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam. And please recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ala. And that was something which was emphasized by many of our Imams, that Allah blessed Imam Hussein with followers whom He had not given to the Prophet. And He had not given with such quantity altogether to Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam, and whom He had not given to Imam Hassan, and whom He had not given to our other Imams. The events of Karbala were not just events that were to take place in the future, and the family of the Prophet did not know what was going to happen. When Imam Hassan was in his final moments in Medina after he had been poisoned, the poison was so severe that the color of the Imam was changing and he was unable to sit at peace, but he would be moving around, speaking with difficulty, and yet when he shed tears, and Imam Hussein asked him, "My brother Hassan, why is it that you are weeping?" He said, "I am not weeping for myself, but I am weeping for you, O Hussein, because my grandfather the Prophet and my father Amir al-Mu'mineen, they told me how it is that you will be left alone on the plains of Karbala. And even though Allah will give you the very best of companions and the very best family and the very best help and support, there will come a time when all of them will be martyred and you will be left alone and you will be calling out, هل من ذاب يذب عن حرم رسول الله هل من ناصر ينصرنا لوجه الله. Is there anyone who will come to the assistance and to the aid of the progeny of the Prophet? And although there will be many people who will say labbaik to your call across the times, there will be no one who will say labbaik at that time and come to your aid, and you will be alone. And after the Imam had wept and mourned the sacrifices that were to come in the future, Imam Hassan called his young son Qasim, one of his family members, but whom Imam Hassan had a special love for, and who had a special love for Imam Hussein. And he brought him to his presence. He said, "O my beloved brother Hussein, this is my young son Qasim, and even though he is only 3 years of age, you know, and I have seen, that he has a special attachment to you as his uncle." And so then Imam Hassan placed the small hand of his son in the hands of Imam Hussein, and he said, "Brother, I ask you to raise my son Qasim as your own son, because I know that there will be many difficulties and many hardships that he will face in his life, and only your love and only your attention will be able to compensate for the loss of his own father." قاسم یتیم تھے، لیکن امام حسین علیہ السلام نے کبھی یتیمی کا احساس نہ ہونے دیا. جتنی محبت چچا کو بھتیجے سے تھی، اتنی ہی محبت بھتیجے کو چچا سے تھی. جہاں جہاں امام حسین جاتے تھے، ساتھ ساتھ میں حضرت قاسم جاتے تھے. کربلا کے پورے سفر میں حضرت قاسم اپنے چچا کے ساتھ رہتے تھے. شب عاشور امام نے اپنے اصحاب کو جمع کیا اور خطبہ کہا، اور اس خطبے میں امام نے ایک ایک صحابی کو بتایا کہ کل شہادت کیسے واقع ہوگی. امام نے بشارت دی اور ہر شہید کو جنت میں اپنا ایک مقام دکھایا. ایک ایک صحابی کا نام لیا. حبیب ابن مظاہر کا نام لیا، مسلم ابن اوسجہ کو بتایا کہ شہادت کیسے واقع ہوگی، جنت میں مقام دکھایا. صحابیوں کے بعد امام نے اہل بیت کے نام لینا شروع کیا. اکبر کو بتایا کہ کیسے شہید ہوں گے، اور بڑے فخر سے امام نے کہا کہ میرے بیٹے بھی شہید ہوں گے. اون و محمد کی شہادت کا تذکرہ کیا، ابو الفضل العباس کی شہادت کا تذکرہ کیا، لیکن قاسم سے برداشت نہ ہو سکا. ایک مرتبہ کھڑے ہو کے کہتے ہیں کہ چچا جان، کیا شہیدوں کی فہرست میں میرا نام نہیں ملتا؟ امام نے بڑی دیر تک اپنے بھتیجے کی طرف دیکھا اور آنسو بہائے، اور پھر امام نے ایک جملہ فرمایا، کہا کہ اے میرے بیٹے، کیف الموت عندک، بتا شہادت آپ کے لیے کس طرح سے ہے، آپ نے شہادت کو کیسے پایا؟ تو قاسم نے بغیر رکے جواب دیا کہ یا عام، شہادت احلا من العسل، شہد سے زیادہ میٹھی ہے. امام نے پھر بھی قاسم سے یہ نہ کہا کہ آپ کس طرح سے شہید ہوں گے. وہ منظر گرچہ امام کی آنکھوں کے سامنے تھا، لیکن زبان سے بیان نہ کر سکے. اتنا کہا کہ قاسم، تم بھی کل شہید ہوگے اور تمہارا بھائی اصغر بھی شہید ہوگا. یہ سن کر قاسم پریشان ہوئے. کہا کہ چچا بتائیے، کیا خیموں پہ بھی حملہ ہوگا؟ کیونکہ اصغر کی تو عمر نہیں کہ وہ خود دشمنوں کے سامنے جائے. امام نے کہا قاسم، ہاں، جب ہم سب چلے جائیں گے تو خیموں پر بھی حملہ ہوگا، لیکن اصغر کی شہادت خیموں میں واقع نہ ہوگی. اصغر کی شہادت میرے ہی گود میں ہوگی. دشمن کا تیر چلے گا اور میری ہاتھوں میں اصغر شہید ہوں گے. عاشورہ کا دن آیا، اصحاب نے اپنی قربانیاں پیش کی. بنی ہاشم اجازت لے کے میدان جنگ کی طرف آگے بڑھتے تھے. بار بار قاسم چچا کے پاس آتے ہیں، جنگ کی اجازت مانگتے ہیں. کبھی حسین یہ کہہ کے واپس پلٹ آتے تھے کہ میرا بیٹا قاسم، تم اپنی بیوہ ماں کا سہارا ہو. کبھی یہ کہہ کے حسین پلٹاتے تھے کہ قاسم، تم میرے بھائی کی یادگار ہو، میں کس طرح سے تمہیں جنگ کرنے کی اجازت دے سکتا ہوں. آخر مایوس ہو کے قاسم ایک خیمے میں بیٹھ جاتے ہیں اور رونا شروع کرتے ہیں کہ کیا ایسا تو نہیں ہوگا کہ مجھے شہادت نصیب نہ ہوگی۔ ام فروہ اپنے بیٹے کے پاس آ کے بیٹھتی ہیں، کہتی ہیں کہ بیٹا کیا پریشانی ہے، ابھی تک آپ نے اپنے چچا سے اجازت کیوں نہیں مانگی؟ تو قاسم نے کہا میں بار بار جاتا ہوں، لیکن جب بھی نزدیک آتا ہوں تو امام رو پڑتے ہیں، جب میں اجازت مانگتا ہوں تو امام منع کر دیتے ہیں۔ ام فروہ نے قاسم کو یاد دلایا کہ مرنے سے پہلے، شہادت سے پہلے امام حسن نے ایک تعویذ دی تھی قاسم کو، اس تعویذ کو کھولا اور امام حسن کی تحریر نظر آئی، اس تحریر میں قاسم کی دلی مراد پوری ہوتی نظر آتی تھی۔ وہ تعویذ لے کے اب دوبارہ اپنے چچا کی خدمت میں پہنچتے ہیں اور امام حسین کے ہاتھ میں بھائی کی تحریر دی۔ امام نے جب وہ الفاظ دیکھے، بھائی کی تحریر نظر آئی، امام مجتبیٰ یاد آئے، اس لکھائی کو اپنے ماتھے پہ رکھا، اپنی آنکھوں سے لگایا، منہ سے چوما اور پھر پڑھنا شروع کیا۔ اس میں لکھا تھا کہ بھیا حسین، جب کربلا میں آپ اکیلے ہوں گے میں نہ گریہ کیا، پھر اپنے ہاتھوں سے جنگ کے لیے تیار کیا، اپنے ہاتھ سے امامہ باندھا اور پھر اس امامے کا ایک حصہ قاسم کے چہرے کے اوپر سے رکھا۔ ابو الفضل عباس نے پوچھا کہ بھیا یہ آپ نے قاسم کے چہرے کے اوپر امامہ کیوں رکھا؟ تو امام نے جواب دیا، دشمن اگر قاسم کے چہرے کو دیکھیں گے تو بچہ سمجھ کے حملہ کریں گے، اگر قاسم کی جنگ کو دیکھیں گے کے لیے آگے بڑھے۔ بہت دشمنوں کو واسر جہنم کیا، لیکن ایک شقی نے ایسا حملہ کیا کہ قاسم سے گھوڑے پہ سنبھلا نہ گیا، زمین کی طرف گرنے لگے تو اپنے چچا کو پکارا، یا عام علیک منی سلام۔ اور روایت میں ملتا ہے کہ امام ایسے قاسم کی طرف آگے بڑھے کہ جس طرح ایک عقاب اپنے شکار کی طرف بڑھتا ہے۔ قاتل قاسم کو واسر جہنم کیا اور فوجوں کو دور کر دیا۔ وہ اس موقع پہ جب امام حملہ کر رہے تھے تو قاسم کی لاش پامال ہوئی، گرد و غبار اٹھا، اور جب ایک وقت کے بعد وہ گرد و غبار دوبارہ بیٹھا تو لوگوں نے دیکھا کہ امام قاسم کے لاش پہ کھڑے ہیں اور فرما رہے ہیں کہ یا بنیا عز علی عمک ان تدعوه فلا یجیبک او یجیبک فلا ینفعک۔ اے میرے بیٹے قاسم، تمہارے چچا کے لیے کتنا گراں ہے کہ تم نے پکارا اور وہ تم تک نہ پہنچ سکے، یا جب پہنچے تو کوئی فائدہ نہ پہنچا سکے۔ لیکن پھر جب امام نے قاسم کی طرف دیکھا تو وہ لاش زمین پہ نہیں تھی بلکہ لاش کے ٹکڑے تھے۔ امام نے اپنی ردا زمین کربلا پہ بچھائی اور قاسم کی لاش کے ٹکڑے جمع کرنا شروع کیے، اور پھر اس ردا کو سمیٹا اور خیام کی طرف واپس پلٹے۔ انا للہ و انا الیہ راجعون۔ وسیعلم الذین ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون۔